Mm-hmm. There's nothing like making your own jams and jellies. But what is the secret to getting them to set properly? And how do you keep them from spoiling? Christine Manning tells us what we need to know. Welcome to Richters Seminars. This video presentation is from a series of free educational seminars on herb and garden topics offered each year at Richters.
So really today I'm not focusing on kind of best practices in preserving overall. I really want to focus on sugar in preserving, because it is one of the questions that I get a lot in my classes is how do I reduce sugar and what does it do to my product? Is it still going to be safe for water bath canning? So we're going to focus mainly on the role of sugar, and there's kind of 4 things that sugar does in preserving, and I'm going to walk you through each of them so that you understand what sugar does, so you can make decisions. If you're coming across recipes that contain full sugar, you'll be able to understand if I reduce the amount of sugar or swap sugar for honey or any other sugar substitute, what's it going to do to my recipe, and will I have a product that's safe and shelf stable? So that's what we're going to talk about now. First thing, I just want everyone to come up and grab a plate. You'll notice that the little things are labeled A and B. Grab a plate and grab a little wooden stick. Each of these things is kind of, the first one is just stewed rhubarb, A, and B is stewed rhubarb with sugar, and we're going to talk about them, and I'm going to get you to taste them and tell me a little bit about kind of what you taste when you're tasting it. So understanding the role that sugar plays in preserving will help you to be able to evaluate recipes and determine what's going to happen if you reduce the amount of sugar. So A that you have is just straight stewed rhubarb. There's nothing added to it. There you go. You're welcome. Okay. So the 4 roles of sugar in preserving. The first one, it's used to sweeten food and accentuate the flavor. So that's why I'm kind of showing you this. Rhubarb on its own is quite bitter. And as soon as you add sugar, you get those high notes of rhubarb. It brings out the sweetness. In a lot of instances, it also heightens the color. So some recipes call for extra sugar because it's going to brighten up those raspberries and make them nice and bright. So you can kind of see the first role is really simple and rather intuitive. It's just used to sweeten food, right? The second role that it plays is it acts as a natural preservative. So it plays an important role in preventing spoilage. So back at the turn of the century and in the early 1920s and 30s, jam manufacturers used to use 75 to 80% sugar, and that was to extend the shelf life. So the higher the amount of sugar, the longer your shelf life is. So they used to use so much sugar because they wanted their jam to have a shelf life of 4 years. They didn't have the refrigeration and the distribution and all of those types of things. So sugar played a really, really important role. So it allows water boils at 212 degrees. Jam sets at 220 degrees. And what allows it to come up in temperature, it's very much like making candy, is the amount of sugar. So sugar allows your product to come up to a much higher temperature. So the less sugar you add, the less likely you are to be able to reach that higher temperature. And by reaching that higher temperature, you're basically limiting the amount of microbial growth. So the higher the temperature gets, the harder it is for microbes to be able to survive in that environment, because you're basically, killing them as you're cooking it up to a high temperature. So it acts as a natural preservative and plays an important role in spoilage. The next thing is that the main spoilers of jams, jellies, and preserves, because they're high acid, you don't have to worry about botulism. Botulism cannot survive in a high acid environment, and that's why these products are safe for water bath canning. There's a difference between water bath canning and pressure canning. Pressure canning is more for things that are low acid, like meats or chicken stocks or anything like that you may want to preserve. Those need to be pressure canned, and that's because they don't have the high acid environment. So the main spoilers of jams and jelly are really mold. So when you open up a jar of jam and you put it in the fridge and you bring it out and you leave it on your counter, liquid forms on the underside of your lid, drips into your jar of jam, and that's really what causes it to spoil. If you're making jam and you don't wipe the inside of your lid, you leave a lot of water on there, mold can grow there. So you might open up a jar of perfectly good jam and see mold on the underside. That's just the mold growing off that water. your jar of jam might still be perfectly fine. So you're trying to inhibit the amount of water that goes in there, because molds can send like almost little root-like structures into your jam, and that causes toxins that then cause the mold. So the second thing that it does is, obviously, as I said, it helps with shelf life. So the next one is that it helps thicken those juices. And now I want you guys each to come up and grab your next sample, if you wouldn't mind. We're going to kind of do a series of samples here. This here is a high sugar jam. So, no, just a C, if you wouldn't mind. Sure. Let's see. I guess we need a few more, is that right? All right. So this is a high sugar jam. I'm not going to tell you the brand name, because I'm nice. But if you were to look at the ingredients, the very first ingredient that you are going to see is sugar. Now, sugar in this quantity does a couple of things. It helps you achieve set. So sugar will bring you up to that 220 degree temperature and helps you achieve set. So just give me a little feedback on what you're tasting with this one. What's the first thing that you're tasting? Sugar. And what does the raspberry taste like? Very. So the thing about sugar is the more sugar you add, the higher your temperature can get, and you achieve something in preserving that's traditionally called set. So high sugar, most jam has to have high sugar to be classified as a jam. So if you were to enter your preserves into the Royal Winter Fair or any other jam contest, one of the things they're going to test you on is your set. So they want you basically to stick your spoon in that jar, pull it out, and your spoon maintains the shape of the sugar, maintains the shape of the spoon. You can't do that with low sugar jams. Only high sugar jams can kind of achieve what's technically called set. But sugar also does something else. So sugar prohibits microbial growth, and this is what I talk about with shelf life. So the higher the amount of sugar, the longer your jam is going to last. But what it does is it basically starves microbes. Sugar absorbs any kind of available moisture or water inside of the jar, and we've talked about moisture is the one thing that helps mold spores appear. So the more sugar there is in the solution, the more it absorbs, the less likely microbial growth is to occur, because it's kind of like you're standing in the middle of the desert, there's no water, you're going to starve from lack of water. It's the same thing for microbes. The higher the sugar, the less water there is available for molds to grow, and microbes basically dehydrate and can't replicate. And it also extracts all of the juices from the fruit, which allows you to achieve that set. So things to think about when you're looking at kind of full sugar recipes is, do I care if I achieve that set? Am I entering this in the Royal Winter Fair? Does it matter that it's really spreadable? Those types of things, you can always make decisions when you're looking at recipes. So if a full sugar recipe called for 4 cups of sugar, and you were to reduce that to 2 cups of sugar, what are kind of the 2 things that are going to happen? 1, your shelf life is going to be a lot shorter. And it's not really the unopened shelf life that's going to see the biggest drop in amount of time. It's once it's opened. So once you open it, there's low sugar there, more moisture is available. You're exposing it to oxygen and air, mold is going to grow a lot quicker. So the thing that I say is, if you want to make low sugar jams, always make them in smaller jars, because then you'll be sure to eat nothing's going to go bad. So low sugar jams, their shelf life is going to be a lot shorter once they're opened. But also it's going to have a much softer set. You're going to get less of that kind of gooey texture that you had in that jam that you just tasted. So the set is going to be a lot softer. But if that's not important to you, if you want to make really low sugar jams because you want to pour them over your pancakes, you're not so worried about serving them on toast, those are kind of the 2 main things. So the next thing I want you to come up and taste, this is a chocolate raspberry jam. So it has very low sugar, so you'll notice it has a softer set. The chocolate is kind of what's giving it any set that it's managed to achieve, because the sugar from the chocolate. Let me get you one. But you'll notice that the texture is a lot softer. Are you guys being able to tell the difference, that it's kind of a lot less gooey? The first one was almost, you can almost tell that it was filled with sugar. Does anyone else want to sample, or we've got it all this time? Okay. So tell me the difference in what you're tasting and what you're feeling with the lower sugar. More tartness, yeah, because you don't have that sugar that's kind of providing you the sweetness. Anything else? A lot more balanced, yeah. And does the consistency bother you at all? Kind of the low, soft set? Yeah, I agree. This gentleman at the front asked me, am I pro-sugar, am I anti-sugar? And really, I'm neither. It's kind of personal choice. It's all lifestyle choice. So the last role that sugar plays is that it works with pectin to achieve set. And does everyone know what pectin is? No? Okay, so there's two types of pectin on the market. One is a liquid pectin and one is powdered pectin. But basically, a lot of people think that pectin is an unnatural preservative and they look for recipes that call for no pectin. But really, pectin is a water-soluble enzyme that's found in all fruit, just in varying amounts. So imagine pectin gives fruit structure, it gives cells structure. So if you were to take a pear, you're going to the gym and you threw a pear or an apple in your purse or your gym bag because you thought you'd eat it afterwards, and then a week later you're doing laundry and you find the apple still in the bottom of your gym bag, that apple is still going to be an apple. It might be a little bit bruised, but that's because apples are very, very high in pectin. If you were to do the same thing with a bag of strawberries, at the end of the week, your strawberries are going to be soft and mushy, and that's because strawberries are very low in pectin. So you'll see things like, apple jam very rarely calls for pectin because it's so naturally high in it by itself. But commercial pectin is actually made from apples. It's made from the skin and the seeds from, not seeds, but the skin and the meat of the apple. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with using commercial pectin. You can make your own as well, but there's a couple things that you need to know if you choose to make your own pectin, is that underripe fruit have way more pectin than ripe fruit. So as a fruit ripens, the amount of pectin lessens. So if you're making your own pectin, you are going to have varying degrees of success with your set, because if you use really ripe apples, your pectin's not going to be as strong as if you were using underripe apples. And also homemade pectin has a very short shelf life. So you can't make it and keep it for months on end like you can with the commercial pectin. And the other important thing to know with pectin is if a recipe calls for liquid pectin, you can't interchange it for dry pectin or powdered pectin because they go in your recipe at very different times. So how does pectin work with sugar? If you were to imagine that pectin is like a chain-like structure, and when it comes into contact with the fruit and the sugar and the heat, it starts to bend in on itself. And in each of those bends, it's trapping moisture. And that trapping of moisture is what allows you to achieve set. So with that raspberry chocolate jam that you just ate, I didn't actually have to use pectin, because if you beat raspberries up, the seeds release natural pectin. So in this one, because there's natural pectin, not a lot of sugar, those bends are going to be a lot looser and they're going to trap less liquid. And that's why you're getting a soft set. That first jam that you tasted, it doesn't have pectin either. The seeds release the pectin, but because there's so much sugar, it's looping in on itself repeatedly and getting a harder and harder set. So sugar increases the strength of pectin, so allowing it to kind of reach that really, really high set. So basically, what happens when you reduce the amount of sugar? We kind of already talked about it. And really, this is the thing to know when you're looking at recipes in cookbooks. If they're high amounts of sugar, what happens? If I choose to reduce the amount of sugar, does it mean it's no longer safe on my shelf? That's not really an issue because we have high acid. You have sugars that are high in fruit that's high in acid, and you're adding a lot of sugar, which is your natural preservative. So it's never really a worry about safety. It's really just a worry about that shelf life and the kind of set that you're going to achieve. So the last sample that I'm going to get you to taste is a zebra lemon marmalade. So if you're not a marmalade fan, you can skip this one. But it's made only with honey. There's no sugar in this whatsoever.
Thank you. Can I take two?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. I'll make up another quick couple of samples. Just 1 second here. So when using honey, if you want to substitute honey for sugar in a recipe, the basic rule of thumb is to use 2/3 the amount. You're welcome. So tell me about kind of what you're tasting with this one. What does honey do that sugar hasn't?
It's so good.
So honey almost gives the texture of jam a silky or smooth, kind of creamy sensation. The thing about honey, though, and the thing about when you're making jam, is the goal when you're making jam, and the reason that jam takes a while and you have to constantly stir it, is you're evaporating away that moisture. So when you're actually adding moisture into your jam, which honey is, you want to use a little bit less of it, because otherwise you have to cook it for so long that you end up cooking a lot of the flavor of the fruit away. So just want to talk a little bit about some alternatives to white sugar. So the first two jams, the really, really thick jam and then the raspberry chocolate jam, both used plain white sugar. The last one, like I said, had no sugar and was all honey. The thing about the marmalade, especially what I love about making marmalades with honey, is that you're using the skin and the pith of the orange or the lemon, and those are so high in pectin that you rarely need to add pectin, especially if you're leaving a lot of the skin in. But brown sugar. So a lot of people really don't like using brown sugar for preserving because it really imparts a very strong molasses flavor. But if you're okay with that, like if you're crafting your recipe because you want kind of that molasses smoky flavor, then by all means feel free to substitute white sugar for brown sugar. But it doesn't change the shelf life or the set that you're going to achieve. It's just going to impart a flavor that can sometimes be overpowering if you're using a really delicate flavored fruit. The next thing is corn syrup. So a lot of people used to use a lot of corn syrup in making their jams. They thought it was a healthier alternative to sugar. It can create a really, really soft spread, so almost more like a syrup. Yeah, exactly. And it also contains vanilla, so that's going to impart a flavor as well. Honey, like I said, contains additional liquid that can upset the balance of a recipe. So a general rule of thumb is if it calls for 3 cups of sugar, use 2 cups of honey. But honey is an excellent substitute. I use it quite a bit in making jam just because I like the health benefits of it, and I also have really fallen in love with that kind of creamy texture that it creates. It's becoming more and more popular in preserving recipes. Artificial sweeteners, the high temperatures, if you're actually trying to cook it up to 212 degrees, it can really impart a strong, strong bitter flavor. So that's one thing that I try to warn people about if they're thinking about using artificial sweeteners, that with jam, it's not the nicest flavor sensation. And then stevia. Stevia is a wonderful substitute for jams and jellies, but if you use regular pectin, so the pectin that I mentioned to you that comes in powdered and liquid form, you're not going to be able to achieve set. When you're cooking with stevia, you need to substitute it. There's a really lovely pectin on the market called Pomona's pectin, and it's actually got a calcium base instead of a pectin base. So if you're substituting sugar in a recipe for stevia, you're going to want to substitute your pectin as well to something that's made with calcium. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with something so soupy, or you're going to have to cook it so long that it's going to end up at the end something that you could kind of bounce your spoon off of at the top, which is kind of similar to that first jam that I gave you guys. That one there, does everyone know what a Brix reader is? So Brix readers are used a lot in winemaking, but I also use them in my preserves, and it tells you how much sugar is contained in a product. So that one, even though it says that there are 13 grams of sugar per serving, there's actually 80% sugar in that jam. So it's 80% sugar and 20% raspberries. So very, very high sugar content. Shelf life on this is great for retailers. Love these types of products because the shelf life can be 2 or 3 years. You can leave that unopened on your shelf for 2 or 3 years and the product still will be fine. Lower sugar products, what you'll see happen is that the jam at the top starts to turn like that dark burgundy color, and then at the bottom it would still be a bright red raspberry color. That's because the product at the top is starting to slowly go bad because there's not enough sugar to keep the microbes away. Does anyone have questions on what I've covered kind of so far about sugar? No?
I think Crofters has no sugar.
There are.
How do they make it so that it stays on the shelf?
Well, if there's no sugar, they can add acid. So a lemon juice can often do it. But achieving set is more difficult. That's why Crofters jams are sometimes a lot more on the very soft side. They also, in some of their jams, use honey. So it's a no sugar jam, but it's a honey jam. Yeah. The 4 things to know about jams is they're a combination of fruit, sugar, pectin, and acid. Those are kind of the 4 general things that need to be present in order to achieve set. So if you increase the amount of fruit and lower the amount of sugar, those things are no longer in balance. But the only thing that will happen is you're not going to have that really firm set, which is what traditional jam is. For jam to actually get labeled jam on shelves in Canada, it needs to have 60% sugar. So when you're shopping, that also helps you kind of determine whether or not you want to buy something that's classified a jam. Well, not like this. No, not with shelf life. You could still pressure can items. So does everyone know the difference between water bath canning and pressure canning? So water bath canning, you're taking a pot with like a regular pot, you're filling it with water. You probably are putting a trivet on the bottom so that hot water can circulate all around your jars. And you're actually covering your jars completely with that hot water. What happens there is it's increasing the temperature of the content and the trapped air inside of the jar. The air gets pushed out and the lid gets sucked down. That's for high acid products. That's for things where you don't actually need to kill any botulism that might be living in the jar because the acid will do the work for you. Low acid recipes, like I make a spaghetti sauce, I do all of my chicken stock. You know, my uncle goes deep sea fishing and brings me salmon. I pressure can all my salmon. The difference there is it goes in a pot with a lid that locks into place like a pressure cooker, if you ever cook rice using a pressure cooker. And you only use about 1 inch of water. And you're cooking that water. The steam is getting trapped inside the pressure canner. There's a little hole on the top with a weighted gauge. That weight determines how much steam gets to escape. And then the pressure inside comes up to a much higher temperature than water bath canning can achieve. And that temperature is actually what is going to kill any bacteria that could cause botulism. So low acid products need to be pressure canned. So they would have pressure canned things, bringing it up to a much higher temperature before sugar came into play. And now there's a real swing away from sugar, right? People are trying to reduce the amount of sugar they're taking in, but they're doing it without really understanding the role that it plays in preserving, and then they're upset with the results. So they get a soft set and they think they've done something wrong. So the next time they make that recipe, they cook the jam for twice as long. But what happens when you cook it for longer is you're just cooking away that moisture, and what you're going to be left with is that same kind of gooey mess that you tasted that was very high in sugar because you've cooked all the flavor of your fruit away and all the moisture away. So as long as you kind of understand sorry, my phone's ringing. Once you understand the role sugar plays, you can look at recipes, especially high acid recipes, and go, this recipe calls for 4 cups of strawberries and 7 cups of sugar. Do I really want that in my recipe? So there's a lot of recipes online, And how do you determine whether they're safe or not? So there's a couple of things to look for. One is if it calls for you to sterilize your jars in an oven. That's an outdated technique that's no longer considered safe practice. So if you see that right at the beginning of your recipe, it's probably a good idea to find another recipe with a similar flavor profile and do it instead of the recipe that calls for sterilizing in the oven. Another one is paraffin wax. Did you guys ever get jars of jam where your grandma had made it with paraffin wax? So paraffin wax expands and contracts in heat and cold. So it is no longer considered safe because it's not providing you that nice airtight environment that's required for shelf stability. Now, my Nona lived to the ripe old age of 94, and she refused to believe that there was anything wrong with paraffin wax because she would just scoop the stuff that was growing brown off the top and eat the beautiful red stuff underneath. And, you know, she lived a long and healthy life, but I'm kind of here to tell you kind of best practices. Another one in England, which this is a very popular kind of end step in a lot of recipes in the UK, is to turn your jar upside down to achieve that seal and not put it in a water bath. That's not really kind of the goal. The goal is to not just get a seal, but ensure that you have an oxygen-free environment. So those are some things to kind of keep an eye out for. If you've checked off all of those items and you're still wanting to proceed with that recipe, just kind of take a look and think about how do I want to use this product in the end. If it's really syrupy, doesn't matter because you're just going to stir it into your yogurt or pour it over top of your pancakes. None of those types of things matter. If you put them in small jars, a short shelf life isn't as important. You're not selling it to retailers who want to have a product on their shelf for 12 months. So how long it lasts, once, you're not going to keep it in your pantry for 4 years. I would assume it would go a lot quicker than that. So it's not as important. So that's kind of the role that sugar plays in preserving. If you're getting into things like pickling, you need to think about acids in a different level. So sugar is kind of one of the things that helps you with shelf life when you're preserving. Any other questions that I can answer? Yes. If you go to higher temperatures and you're using a fair amount of sugar, what's going to happen is you're going to achieve candy levels. So it's going to just get harder and harder. So once sugar achieves a temperature over 220, it starts to caramelize and then it starts to harden and become candy. So 220 is kind of where you want to stop with jam. Otherwise, your jam is just going to get really, really hard and not be spreadable. Mm-hmm. There's a couple of ways to test for set. You can use a candy thermometer and then you know for sure when something's hit 220 degrees. I tend never to use enough sugar to achieve 220 degrees. So if you're reducing the amount of sugar and you want to test for set, you basically just want to use a spoon. I just use a spoon all of the time. Stick your spoon in and lift it up and just pay attention to how the drops are falling off. If they're falling really fast and liquidy, then you need to cook it a little bit longer. As soon as it starts to kind of coat the spoon, where if you run your finger along the back of the spoon and it leaves that nice little trail that doesn't fill in, then you're getting closer. And when the drops almost kind of become lazy, they kind of get fat and really cling to the spoon, then you're getting close to that set. And that's about where you want to stop it off. You can also do the old kind of my mother's trick and a lot of old tricks where you put a plate in a freezer, bring that plate out, put a little dollop on there, wait a minute, and if it forms a skin, you've achieved set. But the problem with that is it's not real in time checking for set because your jam is still cooking for that minute. So while you're waiting to see if you've achieved set, you may have cooked it past your ideal set. So just really the spoon test is the simplest, kind of most interactive way to kind of pay attention. But don't expect to achieve that high level of set when you're using honey or low sugar. It's just not going to happen. You're going to cook it past the point of no return. And you'll have something kind of really hard and gooey like that first sample that I gave you. Yep.
They both came out really runny, so I was trying to
Yeah.
I did a little bit, but after a couple hours, nothing really changed. And then some people mentioned adding sugar, which I also didn't want to do because then it's over sweet.
Yeah.
Like, is there any other options?
Well, you can reduce the amount of the fruit that you're using. So you could kind of almost take your recipe, reduce a little bit of the amount of fruit so it takes less time to cook down. Were you using any sugar at all?
Yeah, and I think what I ended up doing was draining out some of the liquid and then putting it back on the stove.
Right. So chutneys technically take a very long time to reduce down. So chutneys you can cook for an hour and a half. You want to cook a chutney. Oh, really? Because you basically want to cook a chutney to the point where when you take your spoon and run it through the middle, it stays separate and doesn't flow back in. But I'd need to see kind of all of the different things that were in the recipe to really understand kind of what could have gone wrong. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. It's yeah. Well, that's the thing. It can be a little bit right. So did you take a recipe and then double or triple it? So that's the other thing to point out about preserving is that it is scientific. So when you like a recipe that it only yields 7 or 8 jars and you want to make 40, you don't just double or triple or quadruple recipes because you're throwing off the balance of the ingredients. So I always say if you love a recipe, the best way to do it is to do it in 4 different pots if you want to quadruple it. Or you pay attention, once you know how different ingredients impact your pH. So adding more raspberries to a jam is never going to negatively impact my pH. But if I was making a mango peach chutney that had onions, and I'm like, I love onions, I'm going to quadruple my amount of onions, that negatively impacts my pH because onions swing me down into an area that's low acid. So you can quadruple recipes once you understand the role that different things do. Herbs tend to become very, very strong if you quadruple them, especially dried herbs. So if you were to take a recipe that called for thyme and basil and you quadrupled it, that would probably be the first flavor you would taste. It's the same with salt and things of that nature. If you're taking a recipe and doubling it or tripling it, you always want to kind of not double or triple those types of things because the salt is just going to get extreme. It's going to taste really, really salty. And the cooking time, that's probably what the issue was, is that you quadrupled it and preserving recipes really shouldn't be. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm doing stuff for market sake.
Yep.
Probably find someone who has a recipe, has the experience to help me adapt.
Definitely. So if you're taking, I don't know, let's just say a tomato salsa recipe and you want to quadruple it, I would always quadruple my amount of tomatoes and then not quadruple the other things. You kind of want to take a look at all of the different ingredients and think about how they're impacting your pH. So high acid, anything for water bath canning needs a pH of 4.6 or higher, and it's actually the inverse. So higher is like 3 and 2. So you always want to kind of think about how it's impacting your pH as well, because it's not only going to impact your set or your flavor, it can impact whether or not it's safe for water bath canning in the end if you just quadruple recipes. It can swing things in the wrong way. You can take a recipe that was made for water bath canning, and by adding something that negatively impacts the pH, swing it into a zone that's no longer considered safe. Yeah. But if you ever, I batch up all of my recipes, so if you ever need help, you can always just send me an email. So that's the role of sugar in preserving. It really, you just have to keep 2 things in mind, shelf life and set. Those are kind of the 2 main points. And, you know, the lower the sugar, the more microbial growth can occur once you've opened up that jar.
Do you do any freezer jams?
Sometimes, yeah.
So what about the sugar in freezer jams? So you're not worried about shelf life because it's frozen.
Yep.
Can you then reduce it a lot?
Yeah, it's the same thing as water bath canning for freezer jams. You can reduce the amount of sugar in anything. You'll just have to keep in mind that the set is going to be softer. Yeah, you're not going to get that kind of traditional spreadable jam that you get in the jar at the grocery store. Yes?
Do you add some herbs in your canning to increase the shelf life or just for the flavor?
It's really for flavor. Yeah, they're lovely ways to add flavor. So I do an orange onion marmalade with fresh sage and thyme. And the marmalade is beautiful on its own, but the sage and thyme kind of make it really pair beautifully. You take something that's traditionally a sweet toast type product, and the sage and thyme make it pair beautifully with roasted duck or goose or chicken. So herbs are a beautiful way to take a traditional recipe and make it into something that it really wasn't before. Didn't I feed you enough? There's more. Any other questions? Yes?
What's one of the more interesting things that you made a marmalade or a jam or something? What's an interesting ingredient to combination?
Oh, there's so many. The zebra marmalade that I made, that I gave you guys today, zebra lemons. I don't know if you're familiar with zebra lemons. They are yellow and green striped on the outside and pink on the inside. So the flavor is really quite unique and lovely, and the addition of honey gave it that nice creamy texture. But I do everything from strawberry balsamic jam with cracked peppers. I pickle watermelon rinds. There's no limit to what you can do with preserving now. Sorry? So that is an 80% dark Lindt chocolate, and what you want to do with that is generally do it in 2 phases. So you want to soften the raspberries and kind of beat them up with some heat, add the chocolate and let it melt, and then turn it off, and then cover it with parchment paper, stick it in your fridge overnight so that they have a really nice chance to mingle and marry, and then cook it the next day. If you try to do it all in one day, I find the chocolate floats to the surface and the fruit remains on the bottom, and you don't get that really nice kind of marriage of flavors.
But normally you can't cook chocolate at a high heat like that. It will burn.
Well, this is a low sugar, remember? So low sugar, I didn't bring it to 220 degrees because I didn't have the sugar that would bring it up to that temperature. No, like I said, I don't really use thermometer. I just use the spoon test all of the time. You can obviously cook with a thermometer, but because I tend to like lower sugar jams, they're not going to achieve the 220. And if you're using a thermometer expecting it to, you can often overcook what you're working on. Have I tried using? No, I have not. Right, but when you're using sugar sucks that moisture away, and when you're using low sugar, you just know that you have a bit of a softer set and a shorter shelf life once it's opened. So it's the opening that shortens its shelf life. Well, I haven't actually heard any controversy around you. I pickle garlic. I pickle cloves of garlic on their own. They pickle beautifully, and garlic is so healthy for you. I use it quite a bit and have never actually had a controversial conversation. So garlic will turn green when it's exposed to heat. Has nothing to do with it going bad. It can turn green or blue. If you want to not have that happen, especially when you're pickling and you're pouring a hot brine over top, it's almost impossible for them not to change color. If you blanch them briefly beforehand, that can limit. It's just a chemical reaction. There's absolutely nothing wrong with using garlic. It's a chemical reaction. The garlic turns color, but if you blanch it just a little bit beforehand, you can stop that from happening if you're concerned about it. I just educate people that it's a chemical reaction and there's nothing wrong with the garlic at all. Yeah, but like I said, if you were to take it and triple your recipe and add way more garlic because you loved it, you would be negatively impacting your pH. Yeah. So if you are making up your own recipes, a lot of, a couple of years ago, people were very strict about just follow trusted recipes. Don't go off the path. Use recipes that you see. But people are becoming more and more creative in preserving, and they want to kind of be able to play with it a bit more. If you're getting to that point where you really want to get creative, I would recommend getting a pH meter. So you can get pH strips as well. But pH strips, sometimes, the color will stop at 4.5 and bleed to 4.8. How do you know if you've got something that's within that safe zone? A pH meter is really super simple. It's like a thermometer, a digital thermometer, and you put it inside your product the next day. Don't do it while you're cooking. You kind of have to make a batch, let it sit and cool down. If it's something thick and chunky, you want to puree it so you can check the pH of all of the combined product ingredients inside the jar. And then you know for sure that the recipe you created is safe for water bath canning and you have nothing to worry about. I don't know. No, I don't think I have. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yes?
The jars that I find sometimes in antique markets, and they have the metal kind of clippy thing that goes over the top. Are those still safe to use these days?
Well, WEC has come out with new versions of those jars with the rubber seal, and yeah, they're beautiful. They make lovely gifts. They're a little more on the expensive side, but they're still safe. Those old ones, you just want to make sure that the rubber seal hasn't been compromised or cracked, because that's what's going to help keep a nice tight airtight seal. Mm-hmm. A jar can be reused over and over and over again. You just have to make sure that the rim has no cracks or chips in it and that the structural integrity of the jar is still solid. The lid part with the rubber compound should technically only be used once, because once it's been sucked down, if you've ever tried to take a lid off, you kind of have to give some serious effort. That rubber compound can get compromised after one use, so they say, if you're spending a day making jam, you don't want to use a lid that might not give you that airtight seal, so that's the part that should get replaced every time. The threads can get reused over and over and over again as well. Any other questions? There were some people who came in late. I feel like I should start over again. Okay. So a couple years is a question, because what's inside the jar might not last a couple of years. So a good way of knowing whether something inside the jar is still okay is once it's sealed, actually take the threaded part off and store it without the threaded part. Because once that lid has sealed down, you don't actually need that threaded part on there until you open it and put it back in the fridge. So when a product starts to go bad, it produces off gases, and those off gases will expand and push the lid off. So if you have a bunch of preserves in your basement that are 11, 12 months old, and you go to grab a jar and take it to a friend's house, if it's got that thread on, you won't know if the off gases have pushed that lid off. But if you go to grab a jar and the lid is loose, then immediately you can go, okay, what's inside that jar is no longer good. Mm-hmm. But a couple of years, if you had a lot of sugar in your product, what we talked about earlier is kind of the two things to know when you're going to reduce sugar in a recipe is it reduces your shelf life. So high sugar, a lot of sugar acts as a preservative. So if you were making an old recipe with 4 cups of raspberries and 7 cups of sugar, it probably could last up to 2 years, because there's so much sugar that there's very little chance for microbial growth. But when you reduce the sugar, the shelf life is definitely not going to be 2 years. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes. Right. Well, it could help with your acid level, so making it shelf safe. But I'm not really sure. Vinegar would kind of impart a very strong flavor to an elderberry jam. So the only thing that I can think of is they were doing it to help bring the acid, to make it a high acid for water bath canning. Yes? Yeah, I teach preserving classes all over the city. So the last Monday of every month is downtown in Toronto at a place called the Depanneur. I also do in-home private preserving classes. So I bring all of the equipment and the ingredients to your house. We can do preserving classes that way as well. So if you have any interest, you can always just send me an email. Well, I think that's it. If no one else has any more questions, thank you very much. Just in time for the rain.
At Richters, it's not just a garden, it's a whole new world. For herb plants, seeds, veggies, and more, visit us at richters.com or call 1-800-668-4372.